We will now call a meeting of the Budget and Audit Committee on December 8th, 2020 to order at 1:30 p.m. Joining me online today are Mayor Pro Tem Hector Sabito, Councilmember Andrea Bearfield, Councilmember Jim Holmes, Councilmember Kelly Palmer, and Councilmember Josh Borderud. Did I say Councilmember Andrea Bearfield? Did I miss that? My script is messing up here, sorry. And Councilmember Andrea Barfield. On March 16, 2020, the governor suspended various provisions of the Open Meetings Act pursuant to his state of disaster authority. The change was effective March 16, 2020 until further notice or until the state of disaster declaration expires. In accordance with physical distancing guidelines and while providing as much transparency as possible, this meeting will not be open to the public. This meeting is being broadcast live at wccc.tv. The audio is being recorded also. The video and audio recordings will be available to the public. According to the governor and the attorney general, statutes that may require face-to-face interaction between members of the public and public officials are suspended, provided, however, that the governmental body offers alternative methods of communication with public officials. This includes public comment on agenda items. In an effort to allow for as much public input as possible, those who wished to submit their written comments on a listed agenda item were asked to submit their comments to the city secretary's office by 11 a.m. today. The city secretary will read into the record the comments submitted for the items on the agenda at the appropriate time. Are there any changes to the minutes? Hearing none, those will stand approved, and we will now move to our discussion. I believe our first discussion is Paul Kane. Bradley, do you want to introduce Paul, or Paul, do you want to just jump in?
I think I'll just jump in if it's all right, Mayor. Good to see you this afternoon. Good to see members of the committee. Our first item on the agenda today is discussion of the fiscal year 2019-2020 financial audit with our auditing firm. We have Diana Ward will be giving today's presentation here in a few minutes. For some of our new council members, in addition to an independent audit being good financial management and critically important to our bond rating agencies and to the debt markets, Section 14 of our city charter does require the city council to cause an independent audit to be made of all accounts of the city by a certified CPA at the close of each fiscal year and at such other times as may be deemed necessary. JRBT has served as our auditor since 2005. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Diana, assuming she's in the room, and she can present that information to the committee.
Yes, she is moving over.
All right, thanks, Esmeralda.
Welcome, Diana.
Hello. Thank you, Paul, for that nice introduction.
You bet.
Committee members, it's good to see you again. I have a presentation just to go over with you to give you an update on where we stand on the 2020 audit. And there we go. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. And okay, did that move? Did everybody see it move?
We did.
Yes. Okay. So real quickly, we're going to just kind of go over the audit process. We will talk about the single audit status for the city, because the city is required to have what we call a single audit because they receive federal funding, federal and state funding. And then we'll talk about where we stand on the financial audit and go over what our remaining timeline is. Since some of the Budget and Audit Committee and council members are new, I thought I'd reintroduce our engagement team. I serve as the engagement partner. I am the government audit quality partner at the firm. Paul gave you a little intro about the firm. I have served on the city's audit since 2005 and have served as shareholder for the last 10 years. As part of the audit process, we always have a second partner do an independent review and read of the overall audit report, the Kafir, your comprehensive annual financial report. We use a lot of acronyms here, so I'll try and define those as we go. Christy Davis will serve as that independent concurring review partner, and Christy's done this review for the last few years. And all of y'all have already met Katie King, our senior manager, who is primarily in charge of the overall audit process, making sure that the audit is progressing as scheduled, and she reports to myself, and then she works closely with city management. As I mentioned, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the overview of the audit process. As Paul mentioned, the city does engage us to do an independent audit. And what that means is we are a licensed CPA firm in the state of Texas. And so our agreement with the city is to perform this independent audit. If you had, say, an internal auditor who reported to you directly as the Budget and Audit Committee, typically there's ways to develop that as independent, but anytime the auditor is employed by the city, that would be something different than what we do as an independent auditor. One of the key factors in this is to remind you that the financial statements are management's responsibility. So management of the city is responsible for the financial statements and the draft of the Kafir that you will be reviewing in the next few weeks. The audit process, you engage us to come in and we perform procedures to provide reasonable assurance, which means we don't look at everything that the city does, that the financial statements are free of material misstatements and are fairly presented. And again, we're looking for material misstatements. So we're talking very large items. And as part of our audit process, we do a risk assessment to determine what are the risky areas in the city so that we focus our efforts on that. And then, as I mentioned, because the city does receive federal and state funding, there is a federal law out there called the Single Audit Act. It was issued in the late mid-'80s, I believe, and it states that the independent auditor who comes in and reviews an entity's financial statement is also required to test compliance with requirements applicable to major federal and state awards that entity receives. So we will also perform that work, and then we will express an opinion on the city's compliance with those requirements. As I mentioned, single audit is ongoing. It's part of the work that we are doing right now. Just a little bit of overview for the single audit. To be required to have a single audit, your total federal assistance has to be more than $750,000, which the city is way over that. We then categorize the money that the city gets into two types. Anything over $750,000 we call an A program, and we do certain risk assessment procedures on those. Anything less than $750,000 but above $187,500, we do other types of risk assessment procedures in determining which of these programs we're going to test. We've completed those risk assessments. So for fiscal year 2020, our major programs, which means the federal programs that are being tested and that we will give an opinion on, are the Airport Improvement Program. And for fiscal year 2020, this includes both CARES and non-CARES funding. We are also testing the city's coronavirus relief fund funding that they received under the CARES Act. And then, as I mentioned, you do receive state funding. And so state funding that you received that based on our risk assessment that should be tested this year is the Texas Anti-Gang Grant that the city received under the Criminal Justice Division of the Texas Governor's Office. So overall, our status right now is that the work is substantially complete. Katie is in the middle of doing her reviews, and I will be doing my reviews in the next week or so also. And then as we are completing those reviews, we will be meeting with management as necessary and putting that, coming to conclusions on that test work. For the financial statement audit, which I mentioned, the city prepares what's called a comprehensive annual financial report. It's called a Kafir, using the acronym here. Within the Kafir, there will be many financial statements of the different activities of the city. And those are organized according to what we call for the independent audit opinion units. And listed here on the screen are the different opinion units that we will issue opinions on. It will be in one audit report, but these are the different funds and opinion units that we are evaluating as we're doing our test work. You would see items in there that are familiar to you: the general fund, the water fund, the wastewater fund, the solid waste fund. Governmental activities and business type activities that may not be as familiar to you. Basically, we divide, for financial reporting purposes, any business type activities into one opinion unit, and this is citywide, and then the governmental activities into another opinion unit, again, citywide. Your business type activities include water, wastewater, solid waste, and then the 6 non-major enterprise funds that we'll talk about in another meeting. And then everything else that the city does falls into those governmental activities. And then as a reminder to you, the city does have 2 separate legal entities that it is financially responsible for under accounting standards. And so the financial statements of those will be included in the Kafir. It's the Waco Health Facilities Development Corp. And then the Baylor Waco Stadium Authority. So for the financial audit, one of the things that we do is we do look at the internal controls of our financial reporting for the city. And to let you know that we not only come out at year end, which is now, we basically come out mid-November and we stay until mid-December, bleeding over a little bit into the 1st of January. But we also come out at the end of the summer. We usually come out mid-September, and we are able to do testing on internal controls and other planning procedures at that time. And so the internal control testing is substantially complete. The items that are remaining are listed on the screen there. We will review some controls over year-end financial reporting and then some other conclusions. As part of testing internal controls, we also look at what we call general controls, which are the controls over the computer that affect all applications that the city uses. And we engage a contractor, a specialist in reviewing general IT controls. Eric McMillan of the McMillan Group comes in and reviews those. And so Eric is in the middle of performing that testing. And so once he is finished, he'll meet with us. We'll meet with city management and go over the results of that. So for internal controls, we've been doing our test work, and there are items that if we find them, we want to bring to the attention of management and the members of the Budget and Audit Committee. So Katie created this little stoplight for us. And so everything that's in green is good. We reviewed it. We're in the middle of doing final reviews over that. But as of this point, we have not identified any deficiencies in internal controls that we would bring to your attention now. If something were identified that would be a deficiency that would be talking to management, that would go into the yellow column. And then the red column would be anything we find related to internal controls that we felt did not give the city comfort that a material misstatement of the financial statement would be caught in a timely manner. And I'm happy to report we haven't identified anything like that through the course of the audit as of now.
Hey, Diana, this is Holmes. I want to say that this is because it seems like in the last couple of years, we've always found at least some deficiencies that we've kind of worked on along the way, and not material weaknesses, I don't think. But have we had some deficiencies in the past, again, that we've worked? This seems like a new deal, because anytime I've been through an audit, it seems like there's always some items in the yellow that we kind of work on as we go. But maybe we've always been this way.
Yeah, that's a good question. And for those of you who weren't here, and Janice, forgive me for bringing up the past, But
I already did, so I'm leaving that burden. Leave that burden on me. I'll do it often.
Back when the city was converting from its SunGuard computer system to Munis, there was 1 year where they got a little behind on producing interim financial statements and giving them to the Budget and Audit Committee. And that is a key control for the city, to be sure that those interim financial statements are reviewed timely. And so that was a deficiency. I think it's now about 3 years ago that was identified.
Okay.
As the city went through that conversion process, quite frankly, that was part of the reason why these things got behind. And so the city has worked very hard to make sure that during the conversion process that they don't get behind on any of these key controls that are listed here in the green area. We do know that the city has revised its conversion plan, and right now there is no plan to convert utility revenues and billing from the SunGuard system. And so again, that would be, if the city ever made a decision to convert that, you want to be sure that any key controls around those key significant transaction streams for the city are always functioning in a timely manner. Did that help?
Great.
No?
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Danny. Because in my investment banking days, working with our audit partner, I know when we went through a system conversion, there were often obviously issues that year and then trailing years too, or future years too. And it seems like it was a couple of years ago where we kind of got it nailed down finally in our conversion. I just wanted to make sure there was no vestige of conversion, particularly I guess in the payroll and that and budget and audit stuff. We weren't seeing any of that this year, so I'm happy.
Yes, and I'm sorry, if I might add, I think one other area that we struggled a little bit during the conversion too was our bank reconciliation process. And so that was also one of the items during the conversion process that was identified that as Diana said, we've really worked hard to get back on track.
Great. Congratulations, Janice. I know can be, want to pull your hair out in some of those conversion issues, working with spreadsheets and black box reconciliation, but anyway, looks good.
Well, thank you. And we greatly appreciate council's understanding as we work through those issues also, and being patient as we work through to resolve those.
Good question. Anybody else have anything? I mean, again, just interrupt me as we go through. So for the financial audit, which when those of you see the Kafir for the first time, please don't faint. The Kafir is right at 300 pages long. Our test work on the opinion units within that Kafir is in progress. Katie and the rest of the team are working diligently with Janice and her team and other areas within the city that we bleed over into. We don't just talk to accounting, which is one of the reasons, quite frankly, I like my job. You get to go talk to all departments within the city that have a significant impact on the financial statements of the city. Just a reminder to you, there is a significant transaction that will probably jump out at you in several places this year. The WMARS agreement was terminated effective October 1st. And so that financial statement impact will show up this year. So this slide has our remaining timing for completing field work and then getting a draft of the Kafir to you. That first date is that we will have for you a draft of the Kafir and we'll present to you on January 12th. That's the plan right now. And then once that you have had a chance to review it, management has a chance to review it. Our anticipated issuance date for the city is January 22nd. And then we'll plan to present to the full council on February 16th. So those were my prepared remarks. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'll be happy to take those. Again, I'll say thank you to Janice and her team for all the assistance. This is a busy time of year for them, and we appreciate their willingness to work with us to meet these deadlines.
No questions on my end, Diana, but first I want to thank you for the presentation. It's good to see that the no deficiencies or even the mild deficiencies, there weren't any. And so I really want to thank you for, as always, being such a great partner to the city of Waco, and also want to thank our city staff and our finance department for just being so on top of this. And so you guys make this process very easy for council. And so I really just want to thank you guys for your hard work.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other questions for Diana?
Not really, Dylan. I'll just echo Hector. Yeah, great work on getting this. Diana, Christy, Katie, appreciate your work, and Janice for pulling it all together for them. It's great. I mean, this is very important to our, as we'll see in a little bit, to our execution and our bond ratings and all that. So it all kind of fits together. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. All right, I will stop sharing and turn it over to the next item on the agenda.
Thank you, Diana. Paul, I believe next we have a discussion on fourth quarter financials.
Yes, sir, Mayor. That's correct. This item was originally scheduled during our work session at the December 1st City Council meeting, but time constraints required it to be moved to today's agenda. Our budget manager and interim director of OMB, Paul Diaz, will be making the presentation here in just a few minutes. As council is well aware, the outbreak of the pandemic in March had a significant impact on our local economy and on city operations. Despite these challenges, city management is pleased with how we ended the year from a financial perspective, and believe it shows the positive results from the early financial strategies that council implemented in response to the pandemic. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paul Diaz for the presentation.
Thank you, sir. Let me pull this up. Can you all see the presentation? Awesome. All right. So as you noted, our accounting staff is still actively working on the audit. So the information that we're presenting now represents still figures that are under audit. This presentation really has kind of four parts that we want to talk about. First, we want to highlight the city's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to give you an update on sales tax. We want to talk a little bit about the CARES Act, and then mention how we're seeing fund balance as we end the end of the fiscal year. So to start, I wanted to highlight the city's response to COVID-19. Now, early in the pandemic, staff understood that core revenue streams, things like sales tax and hot tax, were going to be negatively affected by the virus. And for that reason, staff really wanted to manage expenses. Now, this was done in three main ways. First, staff was strategic in filling vacancies and really focused on what our core services were, things like public works and public safety. Additionally, we asked current employees to step up and to do more to help fill those vacancies and make sure that we were still meeting that service level expectation that the community demands. Next, we identified operational accounts that were going to be not expensed due to the social distancing guidelines of COVID-19. So these accounts included funds for like special events or for travel and training, since all of those got canceled early in the virus. By doing this across all of the funds, you can see that we had some significant operational savings. The graph at the bottom there shows almost $12 million in operational savings across the funds. The other thing that we really wanted to focus on was looking at allocations and the transfers from the general fund. Now, to understanding that the CARES Act would be coming in, and that would provide financial relief to the airport fund and the transit fund, we decreased the normally budgeted transfer out from the general fund, trying to save that cash in the general fund. We also decreased the transfer out to the equipment replacement fund by $700,000. We did this because we knew the zoo fund was going to be dramatically affected by the COVID-19 outbreak. And so using some of that money that we normally use for equipment replacement and supplementing that for the zoo fund. Later in this presentation, we'll have a slide on the zoo fund. You can really see the impact that COVID had on the zoo fund. But in summary, the being strategic in the way that we filled vacancies, ask our employees to do more, identifying operational savings, and evaluating how we handle transfers in and out of the general fund really produce savings across the board. So as we move into the next part of this presentation, we'll talk about some of the major funds and where they are ending FY 2020. So to start, we'll start in the general fund, and the news is very positive in the general fund. This slide shows that revenues exceeded budget. General fund finished about 6% higher than the adopted budget. The largest revenue stream in the general fund is taxes. This is made up of both property tax and sales tax. This segment of revenue finished 1.4% higher than the budget, and sales tax finished at $40 million, or about 5% higher than the adopted budget. So let's talk about sales tax for a moment. So every month we get a confidential report from the state on sales tax, and the Office of Management and Budget does a deep dive to understand just what's going on in our local economy. We also look at what's going on in other cities in Texas and kind of do comparisons. So we update these graphs every month, and the sales tax information that we're getting, it's a positive story. As you can see, early in the year, the city was beating budget, and this is represented at the graph there on the bottom left. But when COVID hit in mid-March, the actuals dipped below budget for the first time in, several years that we didn't beat the monthly budget. Now, luckily, since May, the city has consistently beaten budget. Now, the graph to the right shows kind of the rolling 12-month aggregate. So we start the preceding 12 months and add those up. And you can see in October, November, and December, we were seeing strong growth in the city. This is consistent with what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of sales tax. But when COVID hit in mid-March and April, we did, for the first time in several years, see that number dip down. The good news is that over the past 4 months, we have starting to see that 12-month rolling aggregate number start to come back to the pre-COVID levels. Just for you all, we will be receiving the next data point in sales tax tomorrow. So we'll be happy to share that information once we get that. Moving on to the general fund expenses. The best way to think about expenses in the general fund is operational and non-operational. And so that's why we wanted to represent it with these two different color schemes here. So let's talk about operational savings. The operational savings came in at 6.5% less than the adopted budget. This is in part due to the savings tactics I had previously discussed. The largest expenditure, as you may be aware, is salary and wages. This segment of expenses finished just 1% below budget. The second largest expenditure in the general fund is employee benefits. This segment finished at just under 4% below budget. As for the non-operating expenses, they did exceed budget, but these were mainly due to projects that were discussed with council throughout the year, and they were 3 big CIP projects that are listed there at the bottom of the slide. These include nearly $8 million for the suspension bridge, nearly $2 million for various street projects, and then $1.2 million for the transit CIP, the BRT. All of these 3 projects were funded via assignments through the year. So as we zoom out to a summary view in the general fund, the news is very, very positive, especially in the midst of this COVID pandemic. So you can see that first column, FY20 adopted budget. You can see our original plan in budget was to have more expenses than revenues, and thereby drawing down the overall fund balance by $3.7 million. However, as it stands today, both with our year-to-date actuals and our year-to-date totals, which include encumbrances, you can see that we're actually adding to fund balance. And this is only assuming that we're getting 85% of the CARES Act that we were allotted. So being conservative in the amount of of CARES Act that we're putting in. But between the great numbers that we're seeing, the kind of recovery we're seeing on sales tax, the CARES Act money, and then those operational savings that we push for during the fiscal year, the fund is actually poised to be in a better position than it was originally budgeted. So great news, positive news coming out of the general fund. Moving on to the water fund. Water revenues total 52.7%. This is 7.25% higher than budget. The biggest revenue stream is charges for services, the water bills, and those came in at 6.5% over budget. Operating expenses came in 3% less than budget, much in the same way that we were looking for operational savings in the general fund. We did this across the enterprise funds as well. The largest savings occurred in salaries as well as employee benefits. As you may be aware, we've started adding these charts to the monthly financials as well. This is rainfall totals. And the reason that we do this is because there's a great correlation between the amount of rainfall that you get and how that affects your revenues. A wetter rain season means less revenues, and the opposite with a drier one. And you can see here that during most of the year this year, we were pretty dry except for September. I got almost 8 inches of rain, which is the third wettest in the last 3 years. Wastewater fund. Wastewater operating revenues totaled $36 million. We're about 4% over budget. The largest revenue stream in this is charges for service, and that totaled just under $36 million, or 4% of the budget. Again, we saw some operating savings in wastewater, almost 4% relative to budget. Overall revenues exceeded the budget, and this is due to the strong sales that we've seen and a non-operating transfer in, while expenses totaled $34 million, or 3.3% less than budget. And then finally, in the WMARS, the third part of our water utility, the operating revenues in this period came in at $8.6 million, or 9.2% less than budget. Now, this is because there was a kind of a change in the methodology of metering WMARS. The decrease is kind of driven by this less flowage. This was the first true up year, so next year moving forward, we'll have a better handle on that budget. Operating expenses through the period did total $9.3 million, or just over $900,000 over year-to-date budget. The proposed amendment in this fund is for $1.5 million, and this will result in the operating expenses to be under budget once we make that fourth quarter budget amendment. In addition, there is a proposed budget amendment of $9 million in the non-operating revenue. Both of these amendments are return of surplus capital reserves to the other member cities and to the wastewater fund. In the auditor's presentation, they had mentioned the change in WMARS. This is kind of an extension of that. In the solid waste fund, revenues total $21.8 million, or 1.3% over budget. Largest revenue stream is charges for service, and that came in at 2.2% over budget. Solid waste operating expenses came in under budget by 2.2%, and overall revenues exceeded the budget by 1.3%. This is mainly due to customer growth. As the city continues to grow, we'll continue to add customers. And also expenses came in under budget about 1.4%. Lastly, let's look at some of the special revenue funds. As you may be aware, the Convention Center Fund was one of the funds that was hardest hit by the COVID-19 impact. As we end FY 2020, revenues total $4.2 million, for about 35% less budget. The graph to the right shows the historical trends, the budget, and what we're seeing in actuals in terms of hot revenue coming into the city. To their credit, though, the CVB operations expense came in at 42% less than budget. So really mirroring the loss in revenue with withholding on expenditures. Overall expenditures came in at $5.2 million, or 36.9% less than the budget. The last three slides are Texas Ranger, the golf course, and the zoo. So starting with the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame fund, the operating revenues finished at 44.8% less than the budget. You can see the sharp decline there in April when the museum was shut down. To this point, we're seeing small growth coming back, but not to the pre-COVID levels that we've seen in attendance. Operating expenditures finished at 11.8% less than the budget. So trying to hold on some of those operational expenditures to balance out the loss in visits and revenue. At the at the zoo, Cameron Park revenue finished at 11% less than the budget. Again, a similar situation with the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame. You can see the dramatic stop in April. But some of the positive news, we're starting to see them come back up in August and September to pre-COVID levels. And speaking with the folks out at the zoo, March and April is their busy season. So COVID hit right at the heart of their busy season. And then finally, at the golf course, operating revenue finished 4% less than the budget. But they did have quite a bit of operational savings, almost 22% less than the budget. And similar to what we're seeing at the zoo, they are returning to pre-COVID levels in terms of the rounds of golf played at the golf course. So in summary, the current general fund year-end position has us adding to fund balance, which is a little bit different than what we had planned. And that's due to the CARES Act and really strong sales tax that we're seeing, as well as holding on some of those operational expenses. Enterprise fund activity is returning to pre-COVID levels in the zoo and the golf course. And staff will continue to monitor the impact that COVID-19 will have on hotel occupancy tax. It is projected that hotel occupancy tax revenue will finish just about 36% below budget. And with that, Mayor, I'll be happy to answer any questions you or the council may have.
Thank you, sir. Any questions for Paul?
Yeah, this is Holmes. I'll go first. I'm just going to kind of start from the beginning here. I didn't want to interrupt you. You're going so well. I didn't want to interrupt the flow. But going back to, let me see, really kind of starting with, I guess I don't have my numbers pages numbered, but this page on the general fund revenues. And then one general comment on, I guess it was the presentation in the council last week, where we've got the the spreadsheet deals, which I find very helpful and very guiding. But what we missed, and I think I talked to you guys about it already, was the year-over-year look, the delta last year to this year, which I think is fundamental. We do show the 2019 and the 2020, but we're not showing the delta and how that changes. If all we're ever doing is looking at our budget comparison, we're going to suffer from budget creep, because once you start comparing budget to budget, your whole budget can get out of control. So I think we need to get back to the discipline of looking at year over year delta and focusing some on that. Many of the same conclusions, I'll acquiesce that. But going from the general fund, where we have an extra $9 million in revenues and an extra in savings of almost $8 million in departmental expenses. I'm just trying to reconcile this from 30,000 feet. So that's about 16-ish. We were 10 over, or 11, let's call it 11 over in non-departmental expenses. The suspension bridge and street, that makes sense. And then which leaves us at about 3, I guess it's close enough, but the 3 go into the reserve. And is that a proper way? I guess we'll maybe have more information on as we talk about general fund balances in the next agenda item. But I'm trying to just do a general reconciliation of more revenue than we thought, less expense, unexpected large items, should leave approximately your excess reserve. So the 2.9 million we're talking about on the general fund, does that go, what do we do with that? Do we reconcile that against our overall reserve, or that's extra cash that we have that we can use in next year's budget? I don't want to lose track of the fact that, first of all, the performance was great in a very tough year. We showed great, trends in revenue and tightened our belt. And I just want to know the benefit of that. I want to get a good idea on kind of where does that go? What do we do with that?
Council member, this is Janice. If I might just add, we are going to look at the impact of the addition to the fund balance in the next presentation, and the impact on the different categories of fund balance.
Great, thank you. I hadn't had a chance to look at that one yet. The same kind of goes for the big utility, water, wastewater, solid waste, great years in all of those as far as revenue. And again, tightening our belts on the expense. So I guess we'll see some of that. Cash balances should have gone up in each one of those utilities. On the WMARS, I'm still, and particularly in the light of the audit part too, it was my understanding that it's more of an operational transition, and there was net, there's not going to be any economic difference of having the city be the servicer versus the city owning part of it. And maybe that's just it takes a while to sort through that economics. But can maybe Paul, you talk about that? And I don't get deep into the WMARS history, but just give me a level of comfort that this sorts itself out after a few months, that there's not an economic disadvantage to the city.
I'll jump in, and Janice, you can clean up for me. When the city took over WMARS, the revenue projections of the other cities were based on estimates that were made previously. We were not metering those volumes that came in from the other cities. And so our revenue projections were based on estimates. And so we kind of shot low this year and missed the mark a little bit, but we're metering them separately. And so in the current budget that we're on now, they're based on their actual metered flows throughout the year. And so that will help us be much more accurate with our revenues going forward. And we don't foresee the drop continuing in the future. We've got an accurate billing system now in place. And
Got it.
That should address that.
That makes sense. Thanks, Paul.
Sure.
Then on going to the, what is a good word for these? Convention Center, Zoo, Hall of Fame, and these four, the golf course, kind of go to the public amenities, maybe, I don't know. Convention Center, this one we just kind of have to hold our water on it. I mean, we've charged, Todd and the group to figure out ways to make this thing more run like other convention centers. We got trying to get Pierce City pricing, and then as we were implementing that, this COVID hit, and there's very little, it makes it tough for people that are using that or all the peripheral industries around conventions, catering and all that. So I'm not disappointed by this at all. I think that just, again, kind of hitting pause here and trying to be conservative with our overhead and planning for the future. I think that's the right thing to do as we look at going to 2021. And really kind of the same on the Ranger Hall of Fame. I feel so empathetic with Byron Johnson over there. We threw him the challenge of I-35 getting torn up completely and ruining access to him. And that's what we were concerned about, 10 months ago. And now we threw the COVID on top of that. We're basically, literally shut him down for a while. Seeing how he's reacted splendidly and trying to figure out ways to cut costs and to raise revenue. My hat's off to what Byron's done over there. The zoo, I'm pleased with that on how we're seeing attendance actually year over year go up. And I was noticing that merchandise sales were up year over year as well, which I was surprised at, but good things seem to be happening there. The same on the golf course. I guess basically my question is, we'll maybe go to the next presentation about how reconciling fund balances based on what looks like a pretty good year operationally. That's all I had. Paul?
I had a quick question. And it was about the CARES funding. And I know that we're conservatively budgeting what percentage of the CARES funds we'll get, but that's still a big chunk. I think, was it 85% is what we're budgeting for? What, is there any risk we don't get any? I mean, you said it was conservative, but what is the basis of that?
Yeah, I'll let Janice speak to that one.
Yes, we actually got 1.5 million upfront. So we have that money. We're assured of that money. Our application for reimbursement is going through the process with TITA, and we're hopefully getting close to the end so that we will know. We actually did a reimbursement request in excess of our allotment. So even if some of the items were disallowed for some reason, we still feel like we're in a strong position to hopefully be able to receive all of that allocation. We did book about $200,000 in the health fund for salaries there, and the other 6.2 or so in the general fund. And we still have over $1 million that we've not recorded yet, that hopefully we will get a resolution on as we work through finishing up the audit.
Is there, and it sounds like this is exactly what you're working on, but is there anything else that we can be doing to maximize the opportunity there?
We have definitely worked with BKD. Council approved a contract with them to work with us on the reimbursement request. They have experience with working with other governmental entities, so we feel like that's a plus for us. We've continued to follow up with TDM to provide any additional information that they need to try to facilitate that reimbursement request. And our request, we tried to limit it to salaries and benefits, which we felt would be hopefully a more efficient review for TDM to get through. So again, I know city management is continuing to talk with other folks too at the state level to try to facilitate getting that reimbursement, certainly in whole, if not all of it, but our goal is to certainly receive all of it. And we did do a reimbursement request in excess of that.
Thank you.
I don't have any questions, but I do want to say the report that was just given by Paul Diaz. Paul, first and foremost, thank you so much. But the report was pleasantly better than I thought it was going to be. Number one, to see the revenues come in the way they did over budget. But I have to say that I really want to give kudos to the city staff and department heads for cutting expenses, controlling and cutting expenses the way they did. This is a year that no one can control COVID. Obviously, we're still in it. So for the revenues to come in the way they did, I was very pleasantly surprised, but also to see our city staff be proactive and try to cut expenses, even in some cases by a third of the entire department. That is amazing to see. I know that when we don't fill positions, other city employees have to pick up the work. And so I'm grateful for the other city employees that have done it without skipping a beat, that we can still offer the services that we're offering as a city that are expected for us to offer. And that we can still do it in a way where we are saving money and trying to be financially responsible as possible. And so City Manager Ford, if you would please, first to you, thank you, but also please pass along my congratulations to your staff and your department heads for just a fabulous job of cutting expenses the way they have. And I'm sure they had to be very creative in some cases to cut the way they did. But even to see, as Councilmember Holmes mentioned earlier, the zoo and the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and the golf course jumping back, it's good news. And so obviously we're hoping for a better 2021, but all the way things were stacked against us in 2020, the staff has done a phenomenal job of just making sure that our finances are sound and in great shape. So I really want to say kudos to you guys.
Thanks, Mayor Pro Tem. That means a lot. I'll certainly receive that compliment and distribute it, since it was the team that was able to pull it together. You've hit the nail on the head. One of the things that I will highlight from my office's standpoint is that we learned a lot about people during this process. We learned a lot about creativity, and we learned places where people were in the convention center one day that came across to emergency management and made huge contributions. I think that really is going to grow new leadership in our organization. So if you want to see a ray of sunshine through the dark cloud of COVID, that's certainly one that I look at and am pleased with. So thank you for your comments.
follow-up question with that, just knowing the stress that the lighting is, that's not helping at all. Oh, well. Knowing the level of stress and chaos that everybody's under, and knowing that city staff is having to take on additional roles, obviously not filling those roles saves a lot of money. Was there any discussion in terms of giving bonuses or increasing salary to those staff that took on significant additional responsibilities and roles?
Great question, Councilmember. Certainly we've watched as companies, across America, really, the one that comes to mind is HEB, who's done a couple of short-term bonuses for their employees to show that they know they've made extra contributions this year. Where we've focused our efforts as a management team on is to really work towards a mid-year salary adjustment for our employees. Previously, I've discussed with council in the past year, kind of needed a couple of different things to happen in order for me to get comfortable with a mid-year pay adjustment. We needed to see revenue solidify, figure out where the bottom was, and then see it start to increase. Y'all heard today that that's certainly happened. And then another thing that we needed to do is lock in some long-term savings. Both those things have happened, and so I am looking forward to sharing positive news with our employees in the weeks to come about perhaps a mid-year pay adjustment that can really get them energized for walking into work in 2021.
Questions?
Yes, Mayor, I've got a brief one. Is there someone on the call that could kind of catch me up on the background with WMARS being taken over to the city? Just kind of a cleaned up, depoliticized summary.
Paul, you want to take that?
I'll take a stab at it. It occurred prior to me coming to Waco, but I'll share what I've gleaned. Essentially, in the past, the WMARS system was a number of partner cities involved in it. Each contributed to it, and whenever capital improvements were made, each issued bonds and had to incur the costs of bond counsel and financial advisors and those kinds of things. So it was a number of different pieces all contributing into the system. It makes sense, and it's much more common in municipal settings to have a large city such as Waco oversee that service and then issue bills to the customer cities based on their consumption. And the benefit of that is, one, it's much more easy to manage from a financial standpoint. With regard to debt financing and capital financing, you don't have each individual city hiring their own bond counsel and issuing their own bonds. That's done by one entity. So there's certainly some savings there for all the partner cities. Of course, in the case of WMARS, I think Waco is around 75% of the total system, but it allows us to provide regional service to all those different entities in a much more cost-effective and easily managed financial structure.
And Josh, I'm happy to provide some more context if you want to. Just feel free to call me anytime and we can talk. I just want to echo what has been said on this call. As we've all faced many challenges over the course of the last year, one of the challenges that households and businesses and even city budget offices have faced is how do we continue to ensure that our budget is in a healthy space. And I am so thankful that based on the last two presentations, both with our outside auditor and our own budget office, that we can report to our constituency, to our citizens, that our city is hard at work to make sure that our finances are healthy, that we are continuing to provide excellent services, and at the same time being prudent to our finances. So I thank you to our staff for all of the hard work in this difficult year, and it's good that we're moving into the next budget cycle knowing that we're in a healthy place, and that's not a given from the last year that we've been in, that would be the case. So thank you to your hard work. We're not here without it. Guess we'll go to the next agenda item.
All right, Mayor. Next, we have a discussion of the general fund reserves, including restricted, committed, assigned, and unassigned fund balance. The positive news that Paul just shared for you on our year-end budget, as Councilmember Holmes alluded to, does result in similarly positive news for our general fund balance. As Janice will explain, we're in a great position with regard to the recent increase in our minimum fund balance to 28%. And we also are able to create a healthy capital reserve fund. And so we think that good news continues with regard to where we're finishing up the year. And Janice, I'll turn it over to you for the presentation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk about the general fund balance, and it does look different for the audit than what you've just seen on the financial statements. And we actually have to have different classifications for general fund balance. We have a non-spendable, a restricted, a committed, an assigned, and an unassigned. And the non-spendable is really things that can't be spent. It's things like inventory if you had a long-term loan. Restricted has some sort of external restriction on it. Committed is more self-imposed. Assigned is really an intention that the council approves, and we have different categories of those. And then unassigned can be used for any purpose, and unassigned is really the category that we use to measure in our financial management statements as far as our financial goals. Looking at general fund, you'll see it looks a little different than just the presentation you saw from Paul. We've actually added about 3.6 million to the fund balance, and that's because as a part of the audit, we actually have to bring in 2 additional funds. We have to bring in the Economic Development Incentive Fund, and that's where we account for the WEDMAC, the Waco-McLennan County Economic Development Corporation, and we have to bring in the Cable PEG 1% fund. Those are budgeted separately, but for the audit, they have to come in. And I think this really illustrates where those fall in the fund balance. You see the non-spendable, you see the restricted, that's the Cable PEG 1% fee. And the committed, again, is the Economic Development Incentive fee. Assignments and unassigned are more related to the general fund. As Paul mentioned earlier, when we were working on the preliminary statements for the fourth quarter presentation, general fund was showing about 2.9 million to be added. We continue to have to make audit adjustments, so that has dropped down a little bit to about 2.6 million. So of the 3.6 million addition to total fund balance going from 87 million to 90 million, you can see that over 800,000 is in the committed area and about 153,000 in municipal information. We were able to take the decrease in assigned, add that to the unassigned, as well as the additional money coming in from general fund to bring that up from 30 million to 48 million. This slide sort of shows a little bit further breakdown. You see the non-spendable for the inventory. We have about 6 or 7 warehouses or inventory types in general fund. We have public works, we have traffic, street signs, we have a central warehouse. So that's a rather large number. Again, municipal information is the PEG, economic development. And then the assignments for the city, we take those assignments and break them into different categories. And for those of you who have been on council for a while, we talk about these a lot in the different categories. We have one for capital improvements, economic development. You'll see we have public safety, culture and rec, public works. We don't have anything in there proposed for 20. That's because it's all in the encumbrance line item. We haven't broken that apart yet. And the encumbrances are related to purchase orders that have been issued that we have to carry forward to the next year to honor those commitments if they've not been completed by year end. We also have an item called subsequent year's budget, and that's really a planned drawdown that's in the budget. And we're going to go through each one of these categories and give you a little bit more information about the different projects that comprise these categories. You can see again that total assigned has gone from 40 million to 25 million. And again, that allowed us to substantially increase our unassigned fund balance. Our capital improvements, that's an area that we have had probably our heaviest assignments through the years, and it's really a place for us to put aside money that we need for capital. That's how we were able to fund the additional money that was needed for the suspension bridge this year. That started off the year at about 25 million. We're proposing for year end to be about 11.7 million, and you can see the different projects. We've got a project for Ranger Hall of Fame. That's money that's been there for a while, but just is there to allow us to complete some requirements there. We have some money for 17th Street Bridge, the Quiet Zone, some money for parks. And we have a new area, Capital Projects Reserve Funding, that we're setting up to allow us to take excess money over our unassigned and move it to a capital projects fund, and then work with council to determine how best to utilize that money for future projects. And right now we've got 7 million. We've got a little bit of money for public safety, and you'll see we've even got a proposed transfer to assigned of 2 million for future years. So we're planning to utilize all of these assignments in 21 for capital. The next area is economic development. And the big one there is the riverfront. We had about 5.5 million, and we had to move about half of it to our subsequent budget category because it's appropriated in next year's budget. We have some money for Prosper Waco, demolition, economic development, STEM, and you can see we have about 3.9, and that's really going to be spent over the next 3 years. Again, these are proposed assignments that we're bringing to you to review, that we will need to take back a resolution for the council's approval of these assignments. And again, as far as these projects being done, they have to go through the appropriation stage before they're actually spent.
Hey, Janice, this is Hector. I have a quick question for you.
Sir.
If you can go back to the previous slide, my friend, please.
Yes, sir. Economic development?
Yes, ma'am. Am I to assume that there will be no cost to the riverfront project for year 21? We won't incur cost again until fiscal year 22?
No, sir. It will actually be in the next slide. We had to actually move it because it's appropriated to be spent in 21.
Okay. So I got ahead of you. I'm sorry.
No worries. No worries. This is actually the proposed assignment. And if you look at our budget that was adopted for 21, you will see that our expenditures are in excess of our revenues of $7.9 million. And the funding from that is a drawdown from assignments. So we have to actually set that money aside in the assignments at the end of 20, knowing that that's a planned funding source for next year's budget. And you'll see that we've got our first transfer to the new Capital Projects Reserve Fund of over $3 million. That's included in the 21 budget. We have the first payment on Riverfront, council member, that you just asked about, the 2.7. We've got some street cash CIP, and we've got some other funds, and those are primarily some master plans and some capital money that was needed for the new police neighborhood engagement team. So that is the proposed utilization of those. You'll notice that on the slide we had before on capital, we've got the 7.9 for the capital projects, and we've got this 3.1. So we have in total $10.3 million for capital. 3.2 will happen in 21. And then as we work with the council on how to best utilize that other capital improvement money, there will actually need to be an official transfer. So we'll need to do a budget amendment, just like we've done a lot of budget amendments during 20 to actually utilize those assignments to fund projects such as the suspension bridge or the transit, bus rapid transits, different areas like that we actually bring those amendments to. And a lot of times when we bring those amendments, you'll see the source of funding is utilization of assignments out of the different categories. On the unassigned, again, this is the one that can be used for any purpose, but because it is so critical to, just like our personal finances, to have a reserve fund, this is the one that we use to measure with our financial management policies. And the council recently approved the goal to go to 28% of budgeted revenues. We're pleased to show that with with the good year that we had really anticipated drawing down total fund balance. We had anticipated a decrease in fund balance. Instead, we're able to add some to the fund balance. And by doing this, you can see that we're closing the year at a 33% measurement to our revenues. We'll feel like that will be a favorable item for us to take to our rating discussions this year, that we've made some changes in our fund balance. We've increased our unassigned. This gets us close to exceeding the Moody's 30% requirement. And with the transfer that we had talked about earlier that we're holding in capital, the 2.2, this will actually, as we're doing our projections for the next 5 years, keep us above or equal to that 30% requirement that Moody's looks at as they're doing our rating. So we feel like that puts the city in a favorable position moving forward as we do our bond issues. Again, as we go forward, we will have to have a resolution to approve those assignments. So the ones that we're showing now are the proposed ones. Those may tweak just a little as we look at additional adjustments for general fund. As I said, we haven't booked all the CARES money yet. We may have to make some adjustments there. We will be showing you the draft financial audits, and that will be at the January budget and audit. And those will look somewhat different than what you saw today because we have to do some, the way that they're presented for the audit will look a little different. And then we will also have a budget amendment for the rolled encumbrances for the PO commitments. So I'll be happy to answer any questions or if you need additional information.
Questions for Janet? Yes.
This is Holmes. Wow, have we ever done this kind of reconciliation before? I love it. I mean, it's really clear. The categories are easy to follow. Janice, I don't remember doing one of these before.
We may have done something similar, but we are constantly trying to figure out a way to better explain this process because it is a lot to take in, particularly when general fund looks different, bringing in those additional funds and having to have those different categories then is a different presentation to what you're looking at all year. So, and just trying to decide a good way to do that. For me personally, it always helps me to see how big the bucket got and then how I'm, able to put aside the different components of that. And in one slide, I think that's a good way to show it.
Absolutely, and I like it because it kind of starts tying back to the efficiencies that staff undertook and we're very successful at, plus the revenue that we have. It puts our city in better shape. And we can see that we've got 28% was our target though, right, Bradley? And so we're at 33. Okay, right. I mean, and then you were saying Moody's, as far as rating, 30% is kind of a number that they look at. And for the new council members, I mean, this is light years ahead. We've moved from 18% reserve to 28 and some strategic moves here and then increased it on top of that. So I think things are good there. And I don't want this thing to get too, let's figure out a sufficient number and how we treat the excess. And whether to figure that into next year's budget or some kind of tax relief or other programs that we've been waiting to implement and initiate, just gives council some different things to think about. And there's in addition to taxpayer interest in having these funds at a very healthy balance.
Councilmember Holmes, this is Paul, if I could jump in. Appreciate those comments and appreciate all the work that you did with us in the past on adjusting the policy and understanding our unassigned percentages. And Janice mentioned it, and I just like to emphasize it more. As right now we're at 33%. As we project that out until 2024 and look at where that 30% changes over time, assuming we have modest growth in our budgeted revenues that you see here. that fund balance will have to continue to increase in order to meet that 30% amount. And that's why, as Janice mentioned, we have that $2 million going from assignments into unassigned later, because what that does for us, it essentially gives us that 30% requirement that Moody's is looking for the next 4 years. And we think that's really important. The other advantage, as we talked about in the past with this process, as we get to those levels, rather than assigning those dollars within the fund balance, we're moving those dollars out now to a capital projects reserve fund. And so we now have, if we make the changes that she's recommended here, we'll be looking at over $10 million in that capital projects reserve fund. And in the past, council has used assignments to fund some of those capital projects. Now we've moved that money into a separate place so that we won't spend it as part of the fund balance. And so I think it's good news on all fronts. We have a plan to keep us at that 30% requirement from Moody's for the next 4 to 5 years. And in addition, because of the great performance we had this year, we're able to create a capital projects reserve fund of over $10 million for future use as different projects are identified. And we will certainly be talking with council more about that in the future. But I really commend Janice on the presentation. And I think the good news that you're hearing from a financial perspective is we're in a really good position, and we will essentially be out of the assignment business with regard to ED and capital in the next year and a half or so. So assuming this moves forward. So we won't be having to account for those assignments, and we'll have one fund where that revenue is, the reserve is, and that'll be fairly straightforward in discussions with bond counsel and bond rating agencies and financial advisor going forward. So again, appreciate council's help on the policy changes in the past, and particularly Councilmember Holmes. I know we spent a lot of time together, and your financial background was certainly helpful in that process.
Yep, thanks, Paul. Point taken. That makes sense. We got to plan for the future on all these. Appreciate staff's work on putting this together. The reconciliation just checks a lot of boxes. A lot of lights go on there. Looks good.
Good.
Quick question that I just want to make sure I heard that right. So we have 33%, but we want to scoot that down to 30%, and but we need the delta between 33 and 30% based on projections. Is that what you said, Paul?
Yes, sir. That 33%, we're 3% over now, but as revenues increase, hopefully in the future, that reserve requirement will have to increase as well. And so as we've forecasted it over the 4 to 5 year period, if we keep that 33% where it is today, add a little bit to it over time, we'll be at 30% by 2024, 2025. So that's a good position for us to be in. Any additional performance where we have revenues exceeding expenditures in the future, those dollars won't need to go to unassigned. We can move those out to capital projects or to other uses that council may have. Yes, sir.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, I hope I don't sound like a broken record, but I think I am. Man, another great presentation. I mean, to see what great financial standing the city is in. Once again, I mean, I'd like to remind everyone that this is in the year of COVID-19, and for us to end the year like this goes a long way, and still be able to assign 33% of our revenues to unassigned or reserved. And so that makes me feel really good. And I know when we first started the budget process earlier in the year, our goal was to move our unassigned to revenues to 28%. And for us in the first year already to be 5 percentage points over that says a lot. And even that as we want to continue to see that grow. So that makes me feel good to know that if we have another year like this or better, that some of that money can go to capital improvement projects or ED or other buckets of expenditures. And so, Janice, thank you for the presentation. I have to agree with Councilmember Holmes. This is definitely easy to read. So thank you for putting it this way. And so kudos to you and Paul, your department, for your tenacity on this. So thank you.
One final comment I might have is it might be helpful for new council members and then just people that are kind of starting to explore the city budget. would be why it is important to have a reserve in the amount that we have. I think that while it's prudent and fiscally responsible, sometimes it's hard to see that amount of money sitting off to the side when we're hungry to put it to work because of the needs in the community. So I think it could be good for just citizens to understand that, yes, we have this money sitting aside, but that helps us get a bond rating. And when we get a bond rating, we can actually do more in the city, and that's what this looks like. In other words, said much better than I just did, but I think that might be something that would be helpful for folks, because I think that you see that money sitting aside and you're like, man, well, why aren't we just reducing? And Jim brought this up, maybe there can be a property tax rate reduction, but you're like, man, y'all are just building up a bank account over there on the money that we're paying into this. And so I think that trying to, in a simplified way, communicate the need to have these reserves would be helpful.
Not to follow you on that, Mr. Mayor, because that was very poignant. But the other piece of that is, should the economy, the projections occur in next year, the way it's predicted, and we have to tighten our belts even more, the reserve will be just that's literally our rainy day fund. And it's literally the things that are going to keep us, make us able to stay afloat, because we have been so fiscally conservative, and we have, made the decisions that we've made, and how we manage and how we fund our projects. So it really does just serve as a safety net for us. And I think that you are right, because I'm going to be your cheerleader about communicating our narrative, that we need to make it a way to make that as clear as possible for our citizens. But I mean, we really are just trying to be fiscally sound, because we are stewards of our constituents and our cities, our taxpayers' dollars. And, it's just an opportunity. This is evidence of good stewardship.
That, any other comments? All right. Thank you so much, Janice. We appreciate you. And we will move on to the next agenda item, Paul, which I believe is the discussion and consideration for fiscal year 2021 CIP plan.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mayor. I think Councilmember Barefield's comments with regard to conservative approaches is a good segue as we talk about our capital improvement program. Over the last 3 meetings of the committee, we've discussed the proposed CIP and the planned debt sale in early 2021. We've talked about the fact that our property values were an important part of that process, and with last year our values being at 1.33% increase, certainly raised a flag for us. So we want to be judicious in our debt sales for the next year or so, until we get a better feel for where our values are going to go. So in particular, at our last meeting, the draft list of projects was discussed, and that included the proposed streets to be included in the CIP via the Better Streets Waco program. So today, Paul Diaz will present a summary of staff's final recommended CIP and how these are going to be financed. And after Paul is finished, I will present some information related to the PCI. I believe at the last meeting there were some questions from council on that. So I'll follow up Paul's presentation with just a single slide on the PCI and the funding levels related to it. So Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, sir. Can everyone see this presentation? Great. So the fourth item on today's agenda is a recap of the proposed CIP and the funding plan. As Paul Kane mentioned, this is kind of our third iteration of it. That work really started in September as staff got together, kind of a cross-departmental group, to make a recommendation of management. At the October meeting, we presented that proposed CIP to the committee and welcomed their feedback. And today, the intent of this presentation is to show how the changes of the debt sale from the time the budget was adopted in the September timeframe to now. So starting with the enterprise funds, Airport had no changes through this process. You can see here in the budget book as presented, $7.59 million, with the majority of that being the CARES Act and a little funding from the FAA. In the solid waste fund, several changes had been made since the adoption of the budget, most notably in the MSW 2400 project. As mentioned in the November presentation, this includes $1.52 million of taxable debt. In conversations with our financial advisor, they believe this gives the city the more flexibility for evaluating different options there at the site in the future by having some of it taxable debt. Moving on to our water utility. Again, there are three parts: the wastewater, water, and WMARS. For wastewater, the original budget had a selling of $3.5 million. As we've worked to kind of refine those numbers and sharpen our pencils, we're asking to reduce that number down to by $800,000 to $2.7 million of new debt in the water system improvements. The only change in the water fund is also a reduction of $500,000 in the water system improvements. It's only changed from the budget as adopted in September. In WMARS, there are two adjustments. One includes an increase in debt for the sale of the Bull Hide project, and then a subsequent reduction in the state Highway 6 improvements. Moving on to the general capital project side of CIP, the proposed FY21 CIP's primary focus is improving the street network and our park system. And the proposed debt sale features $29 million of new debt for road projects. This is headlined by 13.4 for the mill and overlay projects, as well as $11.5 million for the Mars Old Hewitt Road project. We'd be remiss if I also didn't mention that there is a cash portion as well of $2.4 million for road repair as well. So overall, over $30 million, over $31 million in CIP for road repair. And then the other part of the general capital projects is in parks. There's a total of $900,000 of new debt being proposed. This includes the first two stages of the China Spring Park and the Cotton Palace Park. As we mentioned both in the October and November meetings, these are just the design portions of the projects, and that we'll have more funding in the out years for the completion of those two projects. This plan also features $150,000 of new debt for general park maintenance, as well as $150,000 for the cash portion of general park maintenance. So overall, over $1 million in parks, $31 million in streets. With that, Mayor, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Thank you, Paul. Any questions for Paul? Comments? All right, Paul, we appreciate you. Great presentation. And we will move to...
Actually, Mayor, I need to jump in on the PCI just to show some information there if I could. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Please.
At the last meeting, there were some questions from council members with regard to the PCI funding going forward. I think it was 2 years ago, if not 3 now. There was some initial discussion that a funding level of around $35 million would get us to that 70-point goal that was kind of laid out in the past as a way to improve on the quality of our streets here in Waco. So I wanted to give you some updated information on that. If I can share my screen.
And Paul, just for the benefit of the new council members, maybe just like a couple more sense of context for what that means exactly.
Sure, I'm sorry. Great point. I apologize, Mayor. PCI is Pavement Condition Index. We have a software system that has allowed, we rate all of the city streets based on their condition, pavement condition. That data is all entered into a computer software program, and it generates what's called a PCI, or Pavement Condition Index, overall for the city. This number is affected by a couple of things. As you might expect, as streets age, they degrade. And based on soil conditions, and there's different soil conditions all around the city, but the software uses some national degradation curves that take the life of a street based on the type of pavement and shows the degradation of that pavement over time. So we have in the past referred quite a bit to the PCI as kind of a measure of where we are. The PCI changes daily, essentially, at some level as streets degrade. And then also we're adding to that the improvements that we make to the streets and upgrading their condition. And so you have two things working. You have the improvements being made, and then you have the degradation of the streets over time. So those factors are plugged into a computer system that we have, and it allows us to monitor our overall pavement condition index for the city. So I apologize, Mayor, that's a great point. Hopefully.
May I add something to that?
Sure,
for the new
absolutely.
council members?
Absolutely.
Jim Reed, actually, when I first joined council, went over that presentation with me. It was very helpful and beneficial. So I would encourage Councilmember Bordereau and Councilmember Palmer to maybe set up a time with Jim Reed and let him go over that presentation with you, because it opened up my eyes to a lot of the things that the city's currently working on. But Jim is just so knowledgeable about the streets within our city and our city limits. And I think it would be beneficial for both of you to sit through that presentation. Didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to throw that in there because it helped me tremendously when I first joined council.
That's a great suggestion. And we will certainly reach out to both Councilmember Bordereau and Councilmember Palmer to get that set up for you and have Amy and Jim walk you through that. I think that'll be super educational for you and informative. You'll know more about pavement than you ever imagined.
One thing we learned, and I think you hit on this, and that's why we're that 70-point scale, I believe, or correct me if I'm wrong here, but I remember being very surprised at the number of dollars we needed to spend every year to maintain the status quo of our streets, and how much we weren't getting near to maintaining the status quo. And so, and then to move the ball forward and actually be improving. And where does that fall? You brought up the 70 point, I think you said 70 points a second ago. How does that fall into, is that?
So I think the 70 point goal was something that we said where we wanted, it's a 0 to 100 rating scale. So we wanted to have our total system-wide streets at that 70% essentially would be rated good and have good quality. So that's the scale. If I can, I'll try to share my presentation with you. All right. Sorry, wrong screen. I do this all the time. All right, let me go here. All right. Are you seeing the graph at this point? No? Jeez. Sorry. I can hear Deidre laughing at me from through the wall here.
If I was doing this, she'd be laughing even harder because it'd be even worse. So.
All right. So now, do you see the presentation or not?
We do.
Okay, great. Sorry. So the graph shows, first thing I want to note here is in the past, I've talked about the 35 million number, and that was, I believe, 3 years ago. And so what we've rerun the numbers now based on where our current PCI is for the system. And again, this changes essentially every day as we add new projects that we've done, and then those degradation curves working against us essentially. So right now we're at 49.61. To get to 70/20 by fiscal year 30, we would need to spend $41.4 million a year. So that 35 million has increased to 41. And there's a couple of reasons for that. That certainly the degradation is an important factor there. The other thing is that as we've looked at the numbers, and you'll see that in the table at the right, as our total financing of what I'll call PCI related street funding, we were at 17 million in 19, 25 million in the current year. And we're proposing 31.6 million, as Paul mentioned earlier, for 21. So the last 3 years have not been at that $35 million level. So that's essentially pushing dollars out into the future. The improvements, as you're trying to get to that 70 number now, you got to pick up more and more and more to get there. So a pretty substantial number, certainly at $41 million. Total water, sewer, Mars, and general government, we're looking at about 81 million, I believe, in this bond sale. So as we look at the graph and the different lines, you'll see those are based on different funding levels going forward. As the mayor mentioned, if you look at, for example, the orange line at 15 million, if we spend 15 million a year through fiscal 30, we'll actually be lower than we are today. And that shows you how much the degradation of the streets impacts our program. And looking at 20 million and up, you see that those are improvements, although slight, but improvements to the current PCI headed towards 70 million. Again, this year we're at our highest year of the last 3 years in terms of total street funding with regard to PCI. I believe at one of our previous meetings, we showed you Mars and Old Hewitt, which is about $11.5 million in terms of improvements, but didn't do a whole lot for the PCI, primarily because it's not a long street, and the cost to go to the concrete section that we need to have out there in the industrial area is quite high. So you're not seeing a lot of improvement from the PCI from that single project, but we typically make most of our improvements over the last couple of years in our mill overlay program. As we get those streets done and taken care of, we now are turning towards the more expensive streets, and where you start having full reclamation, tearing out the old base, putting in the new base and a new surface. So the projects will continue to get expensive as we move forward. So this gives you some sense of where we are. Again, this year's we're our highest year in terms of PCI related funding that we've had over the last few years, and we'll continue to push towards that every year. The street funding will be discussed with council, and looking at our tax valuations and tax rate and our project priorities that the council establishes, then we'll develop a CIP and move forward. So this gives you some sense of where we are today and where we could be at different funding levels into the future. And certainly none of us know what the future holds in terms of fundability of the program, but this gives you some sense of where we're at going forward.
Paul, this is Kelly. A question for you.
Sure.
So let's say that we have all the money in the world and we're able to secure the needed funds to get the 70 PCI by 2030. What are we looking at once we're at that 70 in terms of maintenance? Are we going to continue to be on this upward trajectory, or will the curve be a little bit more flattened once we're at a higher PCI consistently?
That is a great question. I'm not sure. I don't have that data for you today, Councilmember Palmer, but we can certainly look at that as you look at a pavement program overall. The more that you're able to put in preservation, which is essentially a cash-funded annual operation, then you're able to maintain what you have better. And most of that, as we discussed earlier, is funded by cash now, our preservation program. But certainly as we're doing these new streets, we need to take care of those to continue to maintain them in good quality going forward. So if we were to spend what would be 440 million, I guess, over time, certainly it would allow us to get ahead of the curve, and then we would be dedicating most of our dollars after that to cash to preserve what we've improved. But I can get those numbers and work with Jim and his team on that.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Never wanted to spend $41 million more than I do after seeing this.
Right. It's a substantial amount of money. 41 million, even 35 million was a lot. When we're talking about, as council is well aware, when we're talking about general government debt, we're talking about streets, storm drains, parks, facilities. All of those things are funded out of that general capacity. And so we have a lot of different needs feeding at that from that same trough, if you will. And so we want to work with council. The other thing that's not part of our program over the last 3 years is just looking at capacity improvements to certain streets, maybe building new streets to connect different parts of the city or an improved traffic flow. And that's another element of our general government operations. So we have a whole lot of different projects that are all funded from that same debt capacity number. It's a big challenge. But I think the good news is in fiscal 21, we're at our highest level of funding over the last 3 years. And, you know, we're trying to keep pace with the level of funding that we need. And I think 21 is an indication of council's commitment to that 31.6 million. That's a substantial commitment to our street PCI program. Any questions, any other questions on this chart?
This is Holmes. Just I want to also put into context, where did we start out? It seems like we were at 43 when we did the first one back in 2016, at least when I got on council. I was thinking that it was in the low 40s.
Yes,
PCI.
sir. I believe that's right. Yes, sir.
And then the other bit of context should be what we've already funded into it. I think is more what we've already budgeted into the pavement program. If completed, I think Jim Reed said at the last meeting that we'd be up around 50.7 or close to 51.
Yes, sir.
So
right.
we are making progress. I'm pleased with that. And yes, also for the new council members, we were, you know, there was a lot of deferred maintenance before we really started this program about 4 years ago, putting material amount of dollars into our streets and roads of the city, and the feedback from the citizens has been great. I mean, I think as long as we're spending money responsibly and helping people get to work, school, church, I think it's money well spent.
Yes, sir.
Question of clarification: is any of this for sidewalks? Like,
no, ma'am. This is all just the riding surface, the pavement.
Wow. Okay.
Sidewalks would be another
$100 trillion.
I don't have a question, but I think it's more of a challenge to us as council. You know, I think Assistant City Manager Paul said that we budgeted 31 for this year for streets. You know, I would like to make it a charge for council for the current and even future that we keep our streets budget somewhere between 30 to 35 million a year. That way we can see the increase that we will have and the betterment of our streets by 2030 and beyond. And so I think it's more of a charge for council than for staff to say, how do we get to that 30 to 35 million per year for the next couple of years so we can see the roads in all of our city improve. And that's a big thing, that it's in every part of our city, not just one part, but every part of our city, as well as we move forward to more equity, as well as it's making sure that those streets are in all aspects of our city. And so it's just more of a charge to council of let's hit that 30 to 35 a year. And hopefully we have the financial means to do that in the future.
And Paul, I might have hijacked your meeting here a little bit. I don't know if this is where you intended it to go. We're doing a little deep dive on something that might not have been part of what you wanted to even talk about.
Well, I wanted to respond to council's question with regard to the PCI and our funding we're recommending in the CIP for 21, and wanted to respond to those. Jennifer will probably tell us if we wander too far afield, we'll need to schedule this item separately and discuss it further. But wanted to give you a response in terms of what your dollars will be doing for us in the future.
And just to, and Jennifer, stop me if need be, to Councilmember Palmer's point, Streets has been doing amazing work at finding alternative resources for sidewalks, because, you know, and some grant programs, and they've been finding needles in haystacks regarding money, because they know we have a sidewalk problem. And so just when you chat with Jim, just ask him to go in further detail about that, because they find incredibly creative ways to do things with little.
Excellent point. Any other questions on this one? If not, then we'll go to our last discussion item, which is 2021 bond issue and city's debt portfolio.
At this point, Mayor, we actually have two parts here. The first part will be a presentation from Drew Masterson, our city financial advisor. And Drew advises that he would be able to be on the line around 3 o'clock, and I haven't heard if he's made that or not. But while we're checking on that, I'll give the council, including the new council members, just a little explanation of a financial advisor and what their role is. Their role is to provide services relating to the structure and sale of securities or debt, and to assist issuers in trying to obtain the lowest financing costs. And they're actually regulated by the SEC and the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. The board has put in place a number of licenses that are required. And these various rules and regulations governing municipal advisors are designed to help ensure that the advice that the issuers are receiving is being given by a firm with a fiduciary duty. An underwriter in a typical bond sale does not have a fiduciary duty to the issuers and is not required to act in our best interest. A financial advisor does act in our interest. We also use Mr. Masterson and his firm to provide general financing advisory services such as ED projects, legislative and regulatory issues and other things. So Mr. Masterson has served as the City of Waco's financial advisor for approximately 30 years at various firms, including now his own. So he'll be recapping some of the information that we talked about in our last meeting for this group, and also discussing our notice of intent to sell debt that will be on the City Council's December 15th agenda. So at this point, Esmeralda, I'll ask, has Drew made himself? There he is. All right, great. Drew, good to see you. And I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and especially to meet the new faces on the screen, and look forward to seeing you all in person before too long. To give you a little hope on the COVID front, my daughter is a nurse in DC, and they've told her she's getting her vaccine on Friday. If the approval goes through on Thursday, she's going to be one of the very first because she deals with COVID patients. So it's coming. It's coming. Anyway, turning to bonds. Let's see here. Sharing my screen. Can you all see that graph there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. This is sort of like the Dow Jones for muni bond nerds. It's the bond buyer index, we call it. And I heard that, Jennifer. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen over here, we're near record lows. We hit record lows in the depths of the quarantine in August. Then rates shot up a little bit, but we're way back down. It's been a very volatile year, but all in all, as you'll see as we go through some of the details, rates are near record lows. Wanted to add this slide from previous discussions just to back up and talk about the main tools that cities have in issuing bonds in Texas. One is a general obligation bond, which would be voted and supported by property taxes. And Waco has done that in the past for library, I think maybe 12 years ago. And then what we're going to be using this year and have used for the last 10 years or so exclusively are certificates of obligation. They are also bonds that are, as far as the investor is concerned, backed by property taxes. But in the case of most cities, they issue certificates of obligation, or as we call them, COs, and pay for them with all different sorts of funds, primarily your utility funds. So the bonds do have a pledge of citywide property taxes, but they can go to fund all different kinds of projects that aren't really property tax related. It's just that that's your strongest credit to put forward to the market, your lowest interest rate. So we use COs for, for your streets, for your parks, for your typical tax supported things, as well as your utilities, your airport, your tax increment zone, and everything else that you do. It also gives us economies of scale, and that we end up doing, one larger issue instead of numerous issues for all those different purposes. And so COs are a big part of Waco and most Texas cities' borrowing programs. They're also in the bullseye with the legislature. The legislature does not like them because they're not voted, and they're coming after us hard in this coming year. The main thing I would leave you with, if you find yourself in a position to advocate for Waco and certificates of obligation, is that your utility funds would have to have major rate increases if we went to utility revenue bonds, because the ratings in the URB, the revenue bond space, are based on your bottom line cash flow. And you would need significantly more bottom line cash flow to achieve a AA rating than you all typically budget. So there would be a significant impact over time if we had to stop issuing COs and move back to issuing revenue bonds like we did over 20 years ago. This is a summary of the proposed CO issuance. You can see on the left side of the screen that our general obligation bonds will, for the most part, be amortized over 20 years, with a small portion of them for the Old Hewitt Mars project being amortized over 25 years, just to help make that project a little bit more affordable. Then you see solid waste, water, WMARS, and wastewater all over 20-year amortizations. You can see the different breakouts of the CIP over here with, as you just saw, 30 million for GEO purposes, about 6 million for solid waste. The tax exempt portion is being targeted to a public road in access to the solid waste facility, but on-site facilities at the solid waste facility are being financed taxable to give you the flexibility to use privatized services there that are not, municipal employees, if you will. Then you have 22 million for water, 19.1 for WMARS, and 2.7 for wastewater. So the total project fund would be 80 million in change. At the top, you can see here, we would anticipate issuing about 75.5 million principal amount, because the bonds are typically sold at a premium these days, which that's bond 300. So we'll save that for a different discussion, but just understand that we will be fully funding your 80 million, even if you see a principal amount of less than that. Total debt service over time, over the 25 years, would be 98 million. Average payments of just under 4 million, with an estimated true interest cost as of the first of the month, was 1.99%. So the rates really haven't changed since then. We're also looking at doing some refinancing, as we do most every year. We look at your old bonds to see if, like refinancing your house, if we can lower the interest rate and save some money. In this case, there's about 24.4 million of old bonds, mostly issued back in 2012, mostly in the water department. So the water department will be getting the majority of the benefit from this refinancing, and a little bit in the GEO side, but not much. The savings, annual savings, total about 2.6 million, with a present value of about 2.4 million. The present value is just under 10% of the refunded bond amount. The refunding bonds are a little bit shorter than your COs, so their all-in interest rate is only about 1.5%. And we're taking out bonds with an average rate of 3.5%, so about 2% savings on interest rate reduction. This is a graph of your existing or outstanding debt service. You can see it declines over time as old bond issues pay off. We typically issue each series of bonds with level payments over 20 to 25 years. But as those old bond issues pay off, it causes your payments to decline and leaves you capacity for new issuances. This bottom section of the graph is your tax-supported general obligation or tax-supported bonds, mostly certificates of obligation. And I would just highlight that in 2028, you have a significant drop there in your general obligation payments, which leaves some capacity for future projects. You can see the amortization of your existing payments here as well. Just to talk for a second about bond ratings and your bond ratings in particular. Obviously with COVID this year and the quarantines, many municipalities have been very, very adversely impacted. Waco, fortunately, your finances are very strong relative to many other cities, especially ones that are more exposed to travel and entertainment type of revenues. But if you were looking at a convention center bond, for example, backed by hotel occupancy taxes, those are the type of bonds that have really had a rough year. But this is the city's general obligation bond rating. You're rated AA1 by Moody's, AA+ by S&P. As we go through these meetings this last 9 months, COVID and the quarantine impact on the economy is top of mind with the rating agencies. We don't anticipate any problems with Waco there, even though they have focused in the past positively on your growing tourism industry, which everybody knows about and is a wonderful thing. So we will address that head on and have the stats and everything to keep them happy. But the other things they've focused on over the years is just your strong anchored by institutional presence, which basically means Baylor economy, that you have a very stable, large institution in your city. Then you've grown generally in terms of solid assessed valuation growth and diversified that tax base. Strong financial operating performance over the years with increases in reserves and a very healthy balance sheet, which you just went through in excellent detail. Challenges that Moody's cites, they're snobs. They don't like anybody below the median income levels, family income levels nationally. And with all the student base in Waco, you all historically do fall below the median. So they, at one time, admonish you for your low resident incomes, and then they acknowledge the offset there attributable to the sizable student population. Then the debt profile.
Hey, Drew, I'm sorry. Can I ask you a quick question?
Certainly.
The challenge right there that's somewhat attributed to sizable student population, is it similar to other cities that have a high student population like Austin or Lubbock as well? I mean, would that be the same scenario there as well?
Lubbock, yes. College Station, yes. Austin, they're so big that the university's kind of lost in the mix, but very much so with Lubbock and College Station.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, on the challenge with regards to debt profile, Moody's focuses on all of the tax supported bonds that you have that are, if you just look at it from that perspective, your COs could be paid with taxes. You promise you would pay with taxes if you had to. If you just look at all the COs outstanding, you are high relative to, maybe national averages. But then they recognize the offset being your substantial self-supporting revenues paying your bonds out of your utility system. So it ends up net not being a real negative. And then your moderate pension burden is something that they just always keep an eye on. S&P similarly focuses on Baylor and that's stabilizing influence. And they like the diversification, the economy, your budgetary performance, your cash balances, the fact that you spend cash on capital expenditures and don't borrow 100% of your capital needs. And then your strong financial policies and practices. Their biggest challenge that they cite is your capital needs relating to growth, really. And we show them the CIP and they see that. And so they know the challenges that you were just talking about with regards to roads and other things. We pretty much have an open book with them. Any questions on ratings?
Drew, this is Paul. If I might just jump in real quick on those. I think a couple of notes that we'll want to talk to them about this year, Mayor and Council, is the economic development growth that we've had, the announcements that we've had certainly bolster the economy, local economy, and certainly during the COVID crisis, certainly help us there. And we feel very strongly that that'll be a good story to tell. The reserve requirements will be a good story to tell. And also the work that Council's done with regard to our incentives of raising the minimum wage will be a good story to tell as well. So we feel really good that this year we'll have some good points to make in a difficult year for most cities. Thanks, Drew.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up, Paul, because I my eyebrows kind of scrunched up a little bit in addressing that challenge with weak resident incomes. I mean, because we know that that's a big factor, but I would wonder if at some future budget and audit, maybe we could take a look at really what the considerations of our ratings groups, because I do think, if a challenge was weak resident income, some of the steps that we took this year would definitely put us in a better position in encouraging the people who we bring in our company to actually pay our residents, perhaps that the incomes wouldn't be considered weak. Because I don't think personally that that the student population is what's the attributable factor. But I mean, perhaps I don't know enough. So I was like, maybe this is something that we just need to take a deeper dive on.
Absolutely, we can do that.
Thank you.
The next slide is to discuss the notice of intent that Council will be considering this month for the certificates of obligation. The amount is not to exceed 81 million. As I mentioned earlier, the project amount was just over 80 million. So this just rounded up to the next million to give us a little breathing room there. Maximum rate is that maximum rate under law. It has to be published twice in the local paper and must also be published on the city's website through the date of closing of the bonds. That's a newer requirement that came out of the last legislature. So basically the legislature has come after COs for the last 10 years, probably for sure the last 6. And they've added another publication requirement. They've lengthened the time that the requirements have to be outstanding. And they've also added the requirement that it be on your website, which we can tolerate. The timeline for the issuance, with today's budget and audit presentation, we moved to council adopting the notice of intent on December 15th and moving and essentially approving the capital projects. Then, I guess the important thing to note there is that essentially caps the amount we can borrow once that we publish those notice of intents. Then in February, we would bring the parameter sale ordinance to council and the preliminary official statement. The parameter sale basically says that the city council is delegating to the city manager and probably the finance director the authorization to accept the bids on the bonds and up to a specified interest rate and up to the 81 million authorized amount. The preliminary official statement is the offering document that goes out to the bidders and along with the notice of sale, which lays out the terms of the bids. Then we would have our rating meetings in early February and receive competitive bids on March 2nd with closing and funding by the end of March. So that is our presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
This is Holmes. I had one question, more of curiosity than anything. On the, we're refining into 1.55% versus the all-in at 1.99. I'm just curious, are those refis, do you put those back out into the market or are those just adjusted on the existing bond?
Good question. Yes, we would actually issue two series simultaneously on the competitive sale, one for the certificates obligation of 80 million, and then one for this roughly 24 million of refinancing. And we take that money in a meeting and then pay off the old bonds on March 1st.
Okay.
The old bonds.
You got the load on the big CO and not the refi.
Yeah, the rate on the COs is a little higher because they go out longer. You can see these only go out to 15 years and they're fairly heavily weighted in the early years. So we have lower interest rates in the earlier years, and that's why these rates are a little bit lower.
Got it. You satisfied my curiosity there. Thanks. Looks like a good program. The rates are fantastic and a good rate environment, and was supported by all of the enhancements we've done and the reserves we have. So it looks like it'll be some great execution. I guess if this seems like a long shot, but if we would see some uptick in the rates before looking at the timeline here, before when do we have to set those? Yeah, when do we set those again?
March 2nd.
March 2nd. I mean, would we entertain, what is it, a 30-day close after that? Would we entertain?
The rates are effectively locked in on March 2nd, and then we move towards closing on the 30th.
So there's no hedging requirement or anything if we want to, they're locked in 30 days ahead of time?
From our perspective, they're locked in, yes.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Any other questions? Paul, any other closing comments here?
No, sir. I appreciate the work that Drew and his team have done for us. We did have a part B of this item 5, which was a report on the financial status of existing bond funds. Those reports were provided in your packet. We are somewhat challenged with regard to having two different financial systems that we're having to reach across with regard to those reports, and recognizing the council's commitment today to a 2-hour plus meeting now. I wanted to take the council's preference with regard to whether or not you wanted to go through those reports today, or perhaps if council members have individual questions on those, you can get with staff and recognition of your time today. Up to the committee.
I think option B would be better. If we can look through it, if we have questions, then we can get with staff.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And thank you all for your time today.
Thanks, everybody. So with that,
Our next meeting?
yep. Any future agenda items in our next meeting date? I think it's scheduled for January 12th, 2021. Is that right, Esmeralda?
Yes, sir.
Any future agenda items? All right, there being no further business, we will adjourn the meeting today at 3:34 p.m. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.